Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Meter Cute interviews here on Meter and Mayhem. Today, I'm talking with Clifford Garstang, who's the author of the novels Oliver's Travels and The Shaman of Turtle Valley, as well as his latest, The Last Bird of Paradise, out now from Black Rose Writing. Additionally, he's authored 3 story collections: In an Uncharted Country, House of the Ancients and Other Stories, and What the Zhang Boys Know, which won the Library of Virginia Literary Award for Fiction. A former international lawyer, he lives in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Shall we see what mayhem is afoot? Then sit back, relax, and get ready to fall in love.
I would like to present my latest book, which is called The Last Bird of Paradise. It is set mostly in Singapore, and it is a blended narrative of 2 stories. One is contemporary about a New York lawyer who moves to Singapore with her husband after 9/11, partly to get out of New York City and partly to take a job that is a promotion for her husband. But she's leaving behind her ambitions to become a partner at a major New York law firm. And so moving to Singapore is definitely not in her plans, and it takes a lot of readjustment for her. One of the things that she does when she gets to Singapore, she does get a job as a lawyer in a Singapore law firm, but she's also becoming very interested in local art. And she acquires some paintings by an artist who was active in Singapore during World War I, so 1914, 15, and beyond. And that is the historical narrative. We see in the book excerpts from the diary of this English artist whose name is Elizabeth Pennington. And she arrived in Singapore in 1914, partly to get out of the harm's way of World War I, and partly because she's escaping a bit of scandal in England. And the reason I've chosen this short excerpt from the book to read tonight is that it takes place on Chinese New Year, 2015, and I mean 1915. And of course, recently in February, we had Chinese New Year. And so I thought this would be an appropriate piece to read. 15 February 1915, evening. I do not know what to do. The servants have not yet returned, although they were due back before now, and Uncle is not here either. Where can he be? I sit in the dark with a single lamp so that I may write in these pages, but I am sorely afraid and wonder if I should not douse the lamp as well. I hear gunshots now and then, close by, then far away, and I do not know what it means. At least I believe they are gunshots, although they sound nothing like the hunters' shotguns I remember hearing in the English countryside. Have the Germans invaded Singapore? How is it possible we did not have warning of their approach? Would the watch not have spied them from the observation tower at Fort Canning? It was only this morning that we roamed the halls of Government House, and yet no one told us of any danger. It began mid-afternoon. After the ordeal of the morning and the strain of exhibiting my paintings, I retreated to my room to lie down. I did not sleep. I can only think of the future and what will become of me and the baby whom I have not yet acknowledged. As I lay on the bed, I heard what I thought was a firecracker of the kind that the Chinese seem to love. At first, I found it out of the ordinary, but then I remembered that, in fact, today is their holiday, and so the lighting of their crackers is not terribly surprising. It was their way of celebrating. Upon reflection, however, I thought it was odd after all, because the Chinese were unlikely to light their fireworks in our district, as all the servants had gone. Rather, they would be down at the Padang or along the quay or anywhere in the Chinese district of the settlement, gathering with their kind, near the Joss house, for example. If I were there, lying in the arms of my Captain Bingham, I would not be at all surprised to hear firecrackers erupting all around us. Or perhaps I would be surprised, but I would recognize the custom and would be comforted by Charles, his closeness and soothing whispers, the moist touch of his warm body. Then I heard more such crackers, and I realized the explosions were certainly the report of gunfire, not the tiny poppers that are familiar here. Unless the celebration had taken on a more rambunctious tone than I'd been led to expect, this was not mere fireworks. And indeed, the sound came from much closer than the Chinese district. They seemed to be coming from very nearby, and then they were coming from everywhere at once, and I was sure the road in front of the bungalow was filled with them. I was terrified. When I heard more explosions that sounded as if they were just beyond my window, I squeezed inside the wardrobe. It seemed the only place that wasn't exposed to whatever was happening outside. I heard voices shouting, but no words I could distinguish. I smelled smoke, and at first I thought Uncle's house must be on fire, but the smell diminished. It returned and left again, and I concluded that the flames were at some distance, the smell arriving and departing on the currents. I don't know how long I remained in the wardrobe. All was quiet. I pushed the door open just a crack. I heard what I thought was another gunshot, but it sounded far away. At last, it seemed safe to emerge. 15 February 1915, night. Still no one had come. The servants, Uncle Cyril. The sky was nearly dark. I shook with fear and returned to the wardrobe to listen and wait. I heard a voice. It called my name. I did not recognize the voice at first. Miss, it called. Miss Elizabeth. Raj. It was the voice of Lieutenant Raj, and I knew instantly that he had a message from Charles, or perhaps he had come to take me to Charles. I was safe. I threw open the door of the wardrobe and ran to the stairs, although I could barely see for the dark. Miss Elizabeth, he called again. Yes, Raj, I'm here, I said into the stairwell. Stay where you are, he said. I will come to you. I heard his steps treading the stairs, and then he stood before me. In the dim light, I saw that his uniform was smeared with black, and that his face was also streaked with black. When I lit the lamp, I saw it was blood that had soaked his jacket and soiled his face. You're hurt, I said. What's going on? I sought out linens for bandages and a cloth to wash his wounds. There's no time, he said. I only came to see if you were all right and to tell you not to leave this house. You will be safe here. I have made certain. What do you mean, Raj? Safe from what? Is it the Germans? Have we been attacked? Now there was renewed gunfire, and it was not distant. I must go. You will be safe here. Do not leave. Where's Captain Bingham? I asked. I must go, he said again. He ran down the stairs. I think I shall never see him again. Thank you.
Wow, that makes me want to. I have so many questions after hearing that excerpt. It makes me want to go out and get the book and dive into that. It sounded like they had there was a lot going on, a lot of mayhem, which makes me want to find out from you, what's a book that has created the most mayhem in your life?
Well, when you suggested that you would ask a question like that, I gave it a lot of thought, and I always come back to this one book that I read probably 15 years ago, that was so darn good that I couldn't write afterward. It was just paralyzing because I knew that I would never be able to write something as wonderful as that. It turns out there is an antidote to that problem, which is to read a mediocre book that's also been published. And so I did that, and so I was able to get back on track. And so I won't tell you what the mediocre book was, but the book that caused this mayhem in my life was Let the Great World Spin by Colum McCann, which is it's actually set in 1979, I think, in New York City, but he wrote it after 9/11, and uh, the story is it's actually several stories woven together, but all of them feature the image of a tightrope walker. This actually happened, walking between the two towers of the World Trade Center. And so as the story progresses, people are going down the street and they look up and they see this guy walking on the tightrope between the two towers. And so, of course, we know reading this after 9/11 that the towers aren't there anymore. So it becomes a very powerful symbol of New York.
And what about it was so captivating for you as a novel? I mean, that's a pretty heavy reaction to kind of shut down and be like, I can never write something this good. So what was it about it that really got to you?
Well, the characters are so beautifully drawn. There's a priest, there's a prostitute, there are various other people who all have their individual stories. And at first, you don't know what the connection is between them. McCann has done this in other books as well. And I think at the time I was working on a novel in stories. So I was doing something similar where the characters reappear and you don't necessarily know until later in the book how they're all tied together. But the sort of the philosophy behind what he was doing, the intricacy of the connections, the repeated images, it all just seemed like a perfect picture of New York at the time. And that just blew me away.
Do you feel like in any of the books that you've written, do you feel like you come close to being able to capture that, or how close do you feel like you're getting?
Well, no. I mean, Colum McCann is brilliant, and that book won the National Book Award. So I have not won the National Book Award. But the novel and stories that I wrote, which came out after Let the Great World Spin, did win the Library of Virginia Award, and so maybe that was coming close for me. And I feel that was a pretty strong book. That novel, it's a novel in stories. As I said, it's set in a condominium building in Washington, D.C., and it focuses on the two Chinese American boys, the son of a Chinese immigrant who has recently lost his wife in an accident. And throughout the book, he is looking for ways to raise these two boys in this condo building without their mother. So he's looking for, one of the stories is called The Replacement Wife. And so he's looking for a new mother. He goes to Shanghai to bring his father over from China to help raise the boys. And then we also see the family from the perspective of other residents of the condo building. So because of those connections with these other characters that each have their own starring role, if you will, in one of the stories, I think we see the family from lots of different angles, and maybe that comes close to what McCann was doing in this great book.
That your description also makes me want to go read that collection as well. So my TBR, it just grows and grows and grows. So, and you've got it seems like in this new book, you've got a decent amount of historical research.
Yes. Yes, and that was one of the fun and challenging things about writing this book. It's why it took so long. It took 7 years to write, maybe. I had lived in Singapore for almost 10 years in the 80s and early 90s, and I had been back many times passing through on my way to other Asian cities for work. And so this idea had been in my head for quite a while, but I did want to go do some research to get the feeling of the historical elements of the setting, because I never really focused on that when I lived there, right? You know, I'm living in the moment. I'm going to restaurants and work, and not really paying attention to the history so much. So I had to dive into what was going on in 1914 and 15, and I went I went back to Singapore and spent some time inside several of the historic buildings from that era, um, and getting a sense of what this character Elizabeth would be seeing and feeling, and what had survived now that the character in 2002 is also going to see.
Wow. 7 years. How did you keep yourself, was it a 7 consistent years, or was there some sort of fading in and out of the writing on it? How did you keep yourself going?
Well, interestingly, I had finished a couple of other books before I started writing this, but they hadn't come out yet. And so the writing of this would be interrupted periodically by working on the other manuscripts, which I've forgotten now when I signed contracts for those books, but I actually had a book come out in a novel in 2019 and a story collection in 2020 and another novel in 2021. So those all sort of interrupted and distracted in a good way from getting paralyzed on this project.
Nice. Keeping it mixing it up a little bit.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I'm interested. So I know that were you writing when you were doing the international work that you were doing earlier?
I was not when I lived in Singapore anyway. Later, I worked at the World Bank in Washington, and so that was in the mid 90s. I started working there, and by that time, I was beginning to dabble in writing. So I was working on a novel that we'll call my practice novel because it's in a drawer. Um, so I was doing that. And I was living in Washington, and I took classes at the Writers Center in Bethesda, Maryland, outside of DC. And so I was learning the craft. So that's why this practice novel made sense at the time.
I think that's a common thing that happens for folks, that they write one novel and then that one gets kind of pushed aside, and then they write sort of their real novel, I guess.
Yeah, and I thought it was a real novel at the time, of course. uh, I was pleased that I finished it and that I had the courage to look for agents, and had some interaction with agents over that book. It just didn't catch anybody's attention.
If you could go back and give Cliff of that time some advice, or of any past version of yourself, what kind of advice do you think you would give?
Um, Whether I would listen to it or not is another story, of course. But I always wanted to be a writer. I just got sidetracked. I even went to college thinking what I want to do is prepare myself to write fiction. Philosophical fiction is what I kept telling myself, very pretentiously as a student. But I didn't do it. I took a couple of creative writing classes in college, and I even got a master's degree in English right after college. But no writing happened, and then I started work. Had a great job. There was a professional, time-consuming job, and I used that as an excuse not to write. And so the advice that I would give myself back then would be just do it, dude. don't use being busy at work as an excuse. There are millions of writers who work full-time jobs that are every bit as demanding as the one I had, and they find time to write. And um, that's what I would tell myself. I would also tell myself, keep a journal. Um, I'm too lazy even now to do that. Um, but I wish I had a journal from, the 20 years I practiced law and the years before that. And because there was all kinds of good stuff that happened that isn't preserved except somewhere in my memory.
Um, have you seen they're like one line a day journals that are like for five, like it's 5 years, and each day has its own page, and it's 5 different years, and you can kind of go back and see what you've done in the last couple of years.
That would be nice. No, I have not seen that.
I keep thinking I should get one of those, but never quite do it. Um, so what do you think that you from that time would say to you now? If you popped in a time machine and showed up in 2024, what do you think you'd say?
Well, one thing would be sort of a shaking his finger at me. You should have written all this cool stuff down that you've been doing all this time. Um, but but seriously, although he wouldn't really know what to tell me, I wish somebody would have told me, don't worry about publishing. The what really makes me happy and what drives me to write is the writing and producing work that is as good as I can make it. And it's less important um, to publish the work. Now, so I know this, and I still, of course, am driven to get things published. It's how I've managed to publish 6 books. But um, I'm not selling a lot of books either. I'm happy that they are physical objects, that they're out there in the world, and if somebody wants to read them, they can. But it's certainly not about the money. So it's about the writing for me. And that's what, if I were a really smart 25-year-old, I would tell me.
It's interesting for me to hear you to say not to worry about publishing, because one of the things that I first knew you from, or at least recognized, not knew you, but recognized your name from, is the rankings that you have
Mhm.
for from the push cards. And when I was in my PhD program, everybody, have you seen the list? Look at the list. That like it was like you've got to look at the list, and you've got to like try to work your way up the list. And um so it's really interesting to hear you say that. Um, how did if you don't mind me asking, how did the rankings list, how'd that come about? How did you end up doing those?
Yeah, that's a fun story. I mean, I graduated from my MFA program in 2003, and nobody in that program told us how to get published. And, they taught us how to be our best selves as writers, I think, but not how to publish, and certainly not where to publish. And um, so I had all these short stories that I was hoping to place someplace, but I had no idea where. And um, somewhere from someone, I heard about the strategy of tiering your submissions so that you're not sending your stories to the New Yorker at the same time that you're sending them to a magazine that nobody has ever heard of. And because if the magazine that nobody's ever heard of accepts it, then you have to withdraw from the New Yorker, and that, that's painful, even though you weren't going to be accepted by the New Yorker anyway. But
But we can always
so
hope,
I needed a
right?
tiering strategy. Exactly. So I needed a tiering strategy, but there was no way to develop a tiering strategy. There was only sort of rumors about what were the best magazines. Nobody had a list of the best magazines. And so for originally, just for my own use, I studied 10 years worth of pushcart prizes and made a list of the magazines that had won the most pushcart prizes and special mentions. And I shared that with some people, and they were kind of blown away by it. So I put it up on my website, and then people said, well, and that was just for fiction. And then poets and nonfiction writers also wanted some help. And so I expanded it. And gosh, that's 15, 16, 17 years ago now that I started that and have been updating it every year since.
Do you foresee continuing to do it, or do you want to pass it off to someone else? It seems like it is a decent amount. Seems like a labor of love and a lot of literary citizenship going into that.
It is a fair amount of work. The original investment of time was horrific because I was looking at 10 years worth of data. And now, I've got the last 10 years, and going forward, I look at the current year and lop off the the oldest one. So it's not as big a commitment anymore. Actually, the biggest commitment of time these days is going through all of the hyperlinks on the list to see which magazines have died and which magazines have changed their addresses and which have just stopped without saying what they're doing. So it's a little bit confusing. And almost every week I hear some development. Last week, Image announced that they were closing. So I went through the list because they were ranked in all three genres, and I went through and marked them as having closed. And that happens pretty frequently.
Yeah. Do you do you feel like it is happening more frequently than it used to, or is it about the same rate of seeing journals and stuff closing?
I think it seems more. Um, it seems more. For a while, there was a trend toward just moving to online publication instead of print, but that didn't really matter so much, certainly not for the rankings, except that Pushcart doesn't look as favorably on online magazines as they do on print journals. And so those magazines tended to drift down the list a little bit, but I think that's changing also. I also get a lot of people who will send me updates now. 2 weeks ago, somebody contacted me about a magazine that had announced their closure, so I had to do the same thing, mark them as closed. And I've had offers to take it over, and one of these days I may take somebody up on that.
Well, I appreciate for at least one person, I appreciate the work that you do on it. It was very, especially when I was in grad school, it was very, very helpful. I think, the more time that passes, the more I'll still use it when I'm looking for like if I used to try to do 10 submissions a month. This year it's not going to happen, so I've just sort of stopped keeping track of how many. I mean, I'm still keeping my records, but I'm not like seeing how many per month. But I would get to the end of the month and I'd be like, I need 2 more submissions, and nobody I know's open. And then I would go and look at your lists and pull someone from there that was open. So it helped. So it helped immeasurably for a lot of things, and I think for a lot of people too.
I have to say that when I was doing the updates in December for the 2024 list, I came across some magazines that, of course, I had heard of since I made the list, but um, that looked really appealing to me because I checked, I would look at their website to make sure they were still alive, and found all kinds of places that I wish I had something to send. But since I'm not writing short fiction at the moment, and I have very few poems available to send out, I don't really have anything to submit.
How do you feel about not having stuff to submit?
A little frustrated because, especially given how long it took me to write this book, I have started a new book, but I know that it'll also take some number of years to finish this new book. And I'm tempted to take a break and write some short stories so that I'll have something to send out just to get the rush of acceptances or rejections or, whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, because that's how you know you're alive, is you're hearing back from publishers and magazines.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I had a while there where I didn't submit at all. And for better or for worse, even though I was writing, I didn't feel like a writer, even though I was doing it, but because I wasn't getting stuff out there quite as much. Um, so you said it took 7 years to write the current book. How long did it take? Did you find representation for it, or did you submit to small presses directly? How long did it take for that part of the process?
So that's a really good question. I had an agent for my first novel, which came out in 2019, except that he was only interested in the big presses, of course, and I was interested in that too. And it's kind of similar to the tiering system. We moved our way down the list of publishers, and eventually we were looking at smaller presses that wouldn't have paid him anything. And so we ended up parting company. Um, and he also briefly represented me on my second novel, but lost interest in that also. So I ended up placing both my first and second novels with small presses. And given that I am not as young as I used to be, I was planning to go directly to small presses for this new book because I just didn't want to spend the time that is involved in getting an agent and then going through that process of, you're submitting twice that way. But I talked to my mentor about that, and he insisted that I query agents for this novel. So I made kind of a half-hearted effort at that because I just didn't think that it was going to fly with agents, and I did not have a good response from agents. But I was not discouraged by that at all because what I really wanted to do was go directly to small presses. So I gave up on the agents pretty quickly, and because I have a track record with small presses, I know how they work. I know how to interact with them, and I know that they can do a good job. And among other things, I just totally love the cover of this book. And so, I think I've actually liked all the covers of my books, but this one blows me away. I just love this cover.
Yeah, it's great. Did you have a lot of say in the design of it, or was that all the publisher?
Well, they did ask me for some ideas, and I found some images online that intrigued me, that represented the bird of paradise flower that we ended up with. But that's as far as my input went. And then the designer at the publishing house found a way better image than the one that I had sent in as a suggestion. And then I have no idea how they did this, weaving the foliage in with the font of the title, which I think is just fantastic. Because the story is really about the jungle encroaching on the jungle as metaphor, encroaching on modern life and on the people who have to deal with the jungle. So I just love the fact that the title is sort of being taken over by the jungle.
Yeah, that's 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 cool, for lack of a better. I was thinking as I was working on the thumbnail, and I put the book cover on the thumbnail, and as I was making it, I'm working on trying to pick out stuff for my own book cover now, and I'm just like, yeah, that's a really cool. Wonder if I could do something like that's super cool. Um, so it's the publishing house has done well on that for sure.
Yeah.
Um, we are about out of time, so I wanted to say thank you so much for coming on tonight, and having a chat with me. I really enjoyed getting to hear your work and getting to hear about your writing process and the process of putting that list together and everything. Lots of questions that I've always wanted to know the answer to, I found out tonight. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been fun talking to you and talking about my new book.
What a fun interview that was, huh? Yeah. If you're a writer and you submit your work regularly and you haven't seen Cliff's listings of the rankings based on Pushcart, they can be a great tool. You can get a little obsessed with them though. Uh, when we were in grad school, people were definitely not using them in a healthy way. Yeah, we were pretty insufferable. I went to a very competitive PhD program. And I don't mean that in the sense of like competitive, like high ranking, although they were high ranked the last time they did the rankings or whatever. But I mean in the sense of like cutthroat. Ugh, man, what kind of person would I be had I not gone through that? I don't know. Could be interesting to think about, but it is what it is, huh? Right? Uh, so check out the list, but don't get obsessed with the list, my friends. Don't get obsessed with the list. But you know what you can get obsessed with? Going out and picking up The Last Bird of Paradise. I want to know what happens with Elizabeth, right? Absolutely. Thanks for stopping by.